Hey, it's Dave Brown here, host of Now with Dave Brown on AMI. Check out this latest highlight from the show. We've been remembering, celebrating the life of former Ontario Lieutenant Governor and disability advocate David Onley. To offer his thoughts on Mr. Onley is another well-known disability advocate, David Lepofsky, the chair of the AODA Alliance. Mr. Lepofsky, thank you so much for making time to be with us today. We're grateful.
Good to talk to you, but call me David, please.
Oh, sorry. David, what are your memories of David Onley?
David Onley was a character, a warm guy, a nice guy, a charismatic guy, and a guy who saw the barriers we faced. And in his final report delivered 4 years ago this month to the Ontario government, culminating his independent review of the implementation of the Disabilities Act, he took a lifetime of experience with disability barriers and a public role, brought it all together in a report that frankly was blistering. And it was, I think, the truest David Onley when he told the Ontario government that progress on accessibility in Ontario has been proceeding at, his words, a glacial pace, and that Ontario remains a province full of soul-crushing barriers. These are very blunt terms, but they are completely accurate terms. And when I reflect back on him, I reflect back not just on bringing public attention to the barriers we face, but also giving the government of Ontario 4 years ago a constructive roadmap on how to get Ontario to the legally obligatory goal of full accessibility by 2025. Unfortunately, it is work that remains unfinished after we've lost David, because the government of Ontario has never implemented his report or announced a serious plan to do so, which hurts everyone, I believe.
David, what does it say about David Onley as a person that he was able to be such a fierce advocate, but still express such warmth and kindness and be solutions focused, that he could experience these barriers and face them with fierce advocacy that was wrapped in kindness? What does that say about who he was as a person?
Well, he was a decent guy, but also he was a determined guy. And I think that's, I have to describe how down to earth a person he is. I had the privilege of being invited to his swearing in as the Lieutenant Governor, as the Queen's representative, which is all full of pomp and circumstance and royal prerogative and all that stuff. It was lovely. And it was about a week later, I happened to be at Queen's Park for a news conference or something. And at Queen's Park in Toronto, at the legislature, there are two places you can eat. There's a fancy dining room with, really nice food and really expensive food and so on. And then down the hall, there's a cafeteria where you line up for stale tuna sandwiches in those little wrappers. Well, I was in the lineup for the stale tuna sandwiches, and right behind me was David Onley. And I when I knew he was there, I said, "Hey, David, you're the Queen's representative. Can't you do better than this?" But that was David. I mean, he just let me just have my tuna sandwich and let me get back to work.
He was someone who certainly was tireless in the work that he did, and it speaks to who he was, that he was certainly a man of the people. When you think about that role that he had as the first person with a disability to be appointed to the position of Lieutenant Governor of Ontario, what do you think it was about him in that role that helped advance the disability rights movement?
Well, the thing was, when he got appointed, and somebody in the media called me and said, "What does this signify?" I said, wherever they invite him to go to give a speech, it better be accessible. And if it isn't beforehand, they better make it accessible by the time he gets there. And if you think about it, it would be pretty embarrassing to have a person using a mobility device show up to give a talk as Lieutenant Governor, highlighting accessibility and can't get in. So there it was implicit in the kind of role he had that it had to make a difference. And the other thing is, every lieutenant governor tends to, as I gather, pick some nonpartisan social issue as the cause they're going to speak to. And he picked accessibility, and it's the first time someone had in this role. And that was really important because obviously he embodied the need for it. But there was also a limit to what he could do in that role because he couldn't be controversial. He couldn't call out the government and say, you're doing a lousy job. At least he couldn't say it publicly. And he and I had any number of meetings in his offices at Queen's Park. They're huge. They're usually there for receptions. And it was like him and me in this big empty room. You got to figure. And we caught each other up on what we saw going on and what needed to be done. He kind of put it that we were like cops working opposite ends of the same street. That was his turn of phrase, which I thought was kind of a clever way of putting it. But it was also the way we worked when he was in the media and I was doing my community advocacy. We were our own separate individuals doing our own thing, but committed to a common goal, contributing as best we can. But this, as I said, all comes together in 2019 when he rendered his final report of his review of the Disabilities Act. Just so people understand, the Disabilities Act was passed in 2005, requiring Ontario to become accessible by 2025. That's a 20-year timeline. And it had a number of tools to make sure we got there. Or in an effort to make sure we got there. And one of them was every 3 or 4 years, the government had to appoint an independent review to take our temperature, see how we're doing. David did the last of the 3 independent reviews that have taken place. There's a 4th going on now. But he went out, consulted with people with disabilities, took our collective temperature, and gave the government the news. And it was the bluntest of any of the 3 reports. All the 3 independent reviews done by 3 different people were excellent. But he said, like, they've had a lot of time and we're not making the kind of progress we need. And he gave a roadmap for what needs to be fixed. But as I said before, the frustration for him and for all of us was that the provincial government has not implemented his report. They've held a couple of events within a few months after his report to make it look like they were implementing something, but we analyzed what they announced, and they were basically re-announcing things that have been going on for months, years, and in some cases, decades. It was not a roadmap for new action.
As you think about his legacy, I'm sure that so much of it has to do with the advocacy and so much of the work that he did on the AODA in terms of those independent reviews. But what do you believe his legacy is?
Well, I think we're experiencing it right now. Usually, if a lieutenant governor passes away, there's a news clipping, and a premier will make a statement, and they'll say, "Thank you for your service." And that's it. This has been getting, I believe, David's passing has been getting far more coverage than any other loss of a lieutenant governor that I've seen in my lifetime. But not only that, but the content of the coverage, it started out with the quotes from, the premier and the former premier, Kathleen Wynne, and, the current lieutenant governor and so on. The public figures who properly should and said what ought to be said. But then the coverage expanded, and it has overwhelmingly been coverage of different people with disabilities who are advocating for accessibility. And that's been going on for several days. Our conversation this morning is just the latest, and I'm taping another interview in a half an hour with another news organization right after this. And they're reaching out to a number of different voices in the disability community. And I think that is, and the message that recurs throughout that coverage is to honor David Onley's legacy, implement his report. And that is a crescendoing message, which really shows how, frankly, David Onley is continuing the advocacy effort even after we've sadly lost David Onley from our midst.
David, that's so well put. I've observed that as well. On Monday morning, someone who you know well and who's a regular contributor on the show, Thea Curdy, was on CBC Metro Morning talking about the work that David Onley did. It's just remarkable to see so many people sharing those reflections this week. Our accessibility reporter, Megan Gilmore, came on the show yesterday and talked a little bit about some of the impact that he's had on her life. He was a really, really remarkable man. And David, thank you for making time for us this morning to reflect on his life and legacy. He's going to be dearly, dearly missed.
Always good to talk to you, and thank you for giving the attention that he deserves.
That's David Lepofsky, the chair of the AODA Alliance, speaking to you from Toronto. Do you want to dive into more conversations like this? Watch Now with Dave Brown weekdays at 9 a.m. Eastern on AMI.TV or download the podcasts wherever you listen. Do you want to dive into more conversations like this? Watch Now with Dave Brown weekdays at 9 a.m. Eastern on AMI.TV or download the podcasts wherever you listen.